Claire Matthews's story begins not on a grand stage, but in the hushed, almost sacred halls of the Royal Conservatory of Music in London, circa 2018. For a young woman in her early 20s from a small, impoverished town in the American heartland, each day there was a miracle earned with tooth and nail and an almost religious devotion to the piano. Claire was not just talented, she was a prodigy, one of those rare souls who seem to have been born with music running through their veins. Her full scholarship was her golden ticket, proof that the universe sometimes conspires in favor of dreamers. She lived in a tiny, simple apartment where every penny counted, but her spirit inhabited the concert halls she dreamed of filling. Her greatest dream was not fame or fortune, but pure communion with music, the act of translating the complexities of life into harmonies that could touch other souls. The challenge for her was never the technique. Her fingers flew over the keys with a precision that astounded her teachers, but the belief that she, a girl from such humble beginnings, truly belonged in this world of prestige and legacy. Her parents, across the ocean, were her rock, their voices on the phone the anchor that held her steady against the waves of self-doubt. Autumn in London painted the city in shades of gold and melancholy, a perfect backdrop for the intensity of Chopin, the composer Claire felt as an extension of her own soul. She spent endless hours in dimly lit practice rooms, losing track of time, feeling only the vibration of the piano's ancient wood against her body. The smell of old sheet music, dust, and floor polish was the perfume of her reality. For Claire, the piano was not an object, but a confidant, a living being with whom she shared her deepest fears and her most euphoric joys. Her teachers saw in her not just a pianist of impeccable technique, but an interpreter of overwhelming sensitivity. They spoke of an international career, of Debussy in Paris, of Rachmaninoff in Moscow, and Claire, in her most optimistic moments, allowed herself to dream. She imagined herself on a stage, under the warm glow of the spotlights, the silence of the audience suspended in the air before the first note, a silence that contained all the possibilities in the world. It was a future that seemed not just possible, but destined. With each piece she mastered, with each technical challenge she overcame, she felt that she was building, note by note, the bridge that would take her out of her small life and launch her into stardom. Claire's life, however, was a delicate fabric, balanced on the fragile foundation of her parents' support and love. Weekly video calls were her sacred ritual. She could see their faces, tired but beaming with pride, framed by the small screen of her laptop. They were simple workers, a mechanic and a waitress, who had invested every ounce of their faith and every spare dollar in their talent. They didn't understand the intricacies of a Bach fugue or the structure of a Beethoven sonata, but they understood the universal language of passion they saw in their daughter's eyes. "Play for us, darling," her mother would urge, and Claire would position her laptop near the piano in her apartment, playing pieces that echoed through the small space and across the Atlantic to their modest living room in Ohio. Music was the invisible thread that connected them, a promise that the distance and the sacrifices would be worth it. They were the audience that mattered most, the safe haven her heart always returned to, no matter how far her dreams took her. This connection was the background melody of her existence, the constant harmony that underpinned the tune of her ambition. The tragedy, when it came, was not a dramatic crescendo, but a jarring, abrupt note in the midst of a harmonious symphony. It happened on a gray Tuesday, a day like any other. Claire was practicing, struggling with a particularly complex Liszt passage, when her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, from her hometown. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terribly final. A car accident on the highway, a truck that had lost control on the wet road. There were no survivors. The words floated in the air, meaningless at first. Claire sat on the piano bench, the phone pressed to her ear, the world around her dissolving into a deafening white hum. The piano in front of her, her confidant and partner, suddenly seemed like a strange, cold monolith. Dreams of stages and applause shattered in an instant, replaced by the brutal, unimaginable image of a twisted car and two lives extinguished. The silence that followed the call was not the expectant silence of a concert hall. It was the absolute, hollow silence of the void, the silence of the end of everything. The flight back to the United States was a blur of numbing grief. Claire felt like a spectator in her own life, watching herself move through airports and bureaucratic processes with eerie calm. Her parents' home, once a sanctuary of warmth and happy memories, was now a silent mausoleum. Every object, a coffee mug left in the sink, a jacket draped over the back of a chair. The dusty old upright piano in the living room was a ghost, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. The funeral was an ordeal of whispered condolences and hugs that offered no comfort, only confirmed the reality of her new orphan status. She found herself drowning in debts she hadn't known existed, in responsibilities she was unprepared for. The conservatory in London, her career, her music, it all seemed to belong to another life, to a person who no longer existed. Claire Matthews, piano prodigy, had died along with her parents on that wet highway. The woman that remained was an empty shell, lost in a sea of grief and despair, without a map to guide her back to shore. The months that followed were a slow, inexorable descent into an abyss of isolation. Claire's grief was a thick fog that smothered all the color in the world, leaving everything in shades of gray. She sold her parents' house and most of her belongings, a painful process of dismantling the only home she had ever known. The upright piano, a witness to her early dreams, was sold for a fraction of its value to a family who, she hoped, would have a daughter who would love it as she once had. With the little money she could earn, she moved to a small, impersonal apartment in an anonymous city, seeking oblivion in obscurity. Music, once her salvation, became her torture. Trying to play was like trying to breathe with lungs full of glass. Each note was a stab, each melody a reminder of the joy that was gone forever. Then she stopped. Silence became her only companion. Her fingers, once so nimble and expressive, became stiff and awkward. Her identity as a musician was buried beneath layers of pain and apathy. She needed to survive, and survival required her to forget who she was. Financial need was a hungry, relentless monster. Her savings were quickly depleting, and desperation began to knock on her door with a cruel urgency. Claire, the woman who had once been applauded by ambassadors and critics at student recitals in London, now found herself leafing through job advertisements for positions that required nothing more than a present body and a willingness to work hard. That was how she came across the ad. Housekeeper wanted for private residence, discreet and efficient, competitive salary. The word discreet jumped out at her. That was what she wanted, to be invisible, a functional ghost in a world that was not her own. The interview was held in the mansion itself, a fortress of stone and glass that seemed too big for the sky. The housekeeper, a stern woman with a tight bun, barely glanced at her resume, which Claire had carefully edited to omit any mention of her musical background. She was just another face in the crowd of needy people. When she was hired, she felt no relief, only cold resignation. She was trading her soul for a salary, her art for a uniform. It was the official end of an era and the beginning of a long, silent penance. So began Claire Matthews's life at Belmont Mansion. The next 3 years unfolded in a dull, gray routine, an endless cycle of cleaning, polishing, and organizing the opulence of a man she rarely saw. Richard Belmont was a presence more than a person, a tall, imposing figure, always dressed in expensive suits that resembled armor. His voice, when she heard it on rare occasions, was a deep, clipped baritone, accustomed to giving orders and receiving no answers. He moved through the house like a king in his castle, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. To him, the staff were not human beings, but invisible cogs in a machine designed for his comfort and convenience. Claire quickly learned the rules: keep her head down, make no eye contact, be silent and efficient. She became an expert at invisibility, moving through the vast, cold rooms like a shadow, her past and her identity locked away in a vault deep within herself. It was a hollow existence, but a safe one, a form of survival that required the daily sacrifice of one's soul. Richard Belmont was a man carved out of ambition and cynicism. Heir to a fortune, he had multiplied it with ruthless aggression in the business world, a world where empathy was a weakness and emotion a liability. He saw the world as a vast chessboard, and people, including his staff, were pawns to be moved and, if necessary, sacrificed to achieve his goals. His mansion was not a home. It was a showcase, a stage on which to display his power and status. Every work of art, every piece of designer furniture, every bottle of wine in his cellar was a statement of his superiority. Behind the facade of control and success, however, there was a profound emptiness. Richard secretly despised those who possessed something he could not buy: genuine talent, authentic passion. He surrounded himself with beauty, but was incapable of feeling it. He listened to classical music on his state-of-the-art sound system, not for the love of art, but because it was what was expected of a man of his position. He was a prisoner of his own image, a lonely king in a castle of ice, and the coldness that emanated from him was a reflection of the desolate landscape of his soul. In the heart of the mansion, in the center of the main living room, stood the object that represented Claire's daily torture, the Steinway & Sons Model D grand piano, a masterpiece of glossy black lacquer and pristine ivory. It was the same model she dreamed of playing at Carnegie Hall. Every day, part of her routine was to meticulously remove every speck of dust from its mirrored surface, to polish the keys she was not allowed to press. The act was a ritual of silent agony. Her fingers, covered in the cleaning glove, hovered millimeters from the keys, feeling a magnetic pull, a physical desire so intense it was almost painful. She could hear Beethoven sonatas and Debussy preludes screaming inside her head, begging to be released. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would trace the outline of a key with her fingertip, feeling the coolness of the ivory through the fabric, an electric shock of memory and longing that made her recoil as if she had been burned. The piano was a monument to the life she had lost, a predator sleeping in the center of its gilded prison, and each day she fought the battle not to wake it. The passage of time at Belmont Manor was marked not by days or weeks, but by the endless repetition of tasks, dusting marble statues worth more than anything her parents had ever owned, vacuuming Persian rugs that were softer than any lawn she had ever walked on. To Claire, the opulence around her was not inspiring, it was oppressive. It was a constant reminder of the unbridgeable distance between Richard Belmont's world and her own. She watched the flow of important guests, men and women with polite smiles and empty eyes, who came and went from the mansion, treating her like part of the furniture. She learned to read the nuances of her employer's mood by the sound of his footsteps in the hallway or the tone of his phone conversations. There was a deep loneliness about him, a suppressed anger that seemed to poison the very air of the house. She saw the sadness hidden behind the expensive suit, an unhappiness as vast and cold as the rooms she cleaned. In her moments of reflection, she wondered if his prison, made of gold and expectations, was not in some way more inescapable than her own, made of grief and need. Richard Belmont's discovery of Claire's past was not a dramatic event, but a trivial detail that piqued his predatory curiosity. Perhaps it was during a routine background check to renew his home insurance, or perhaps a careless comment from another employee about how Claire seemed too polite for the job. The name Royal Conservatory of Music on an old application was like a flash of light in the darkness of his boredom. The information did not generate empathy or admiration in Richard. Instead, it ignited a spark of calculated cruelty. He looked at the silent, efficient figure who was his maid and saw an opportunity not to help, but to use. The idea blossomed in his mind with malicious perfection, an annual gala he was planning, an event to impress the city's biggest names. What more eccentric and memorable spectacle could he offer than his maid, the invisible girl who cleaned his ashes, playing the piano like a virtuoso? The idea pleased him immensely. It was the ultimate display of power, reducing a person's art, talent, and soul to mere entertainment, a parlor trick for his wealthy guests. Planning the gala became Richard's new obsession. He oversaw every detail with maniacal precision, from the menu to the guest list, which included 200 of the country's most influential millionaires, art critics, investors, and socialites. But his main focus, his secret centerpiece, was Claire. He watched her from afar as she worked, a new kind of interest in his eyes. He saw the way her hands, now accustomed to mops and dust cloths, still retained an innate delicacy. He imagined the shocking contrast. The girl in the shapeless gray uniform, sitting at her magnificent Steinway, creating sublime music. Her humiliation would be his triumph. He did not inform her of his plan right away. He savored the anticipation, letting the idea marinate in his mind. He reveled in the power he felt, the knowledge that he held her fate in his hands. For Richard, this was not about music, it was about control. It was about showing the world that everything and everyone in his domain, even the purest talent, existed only to serve him and to enhance his own legend. The party would be his stage, and Claire, his most exquisite puppet. The day of the gala arrived, bringing with it an air of tense excitement to the mansion. Catering trucks, florists, and lighting crews transformed the house into a fairy tale setting. For the staff, it was the most stressful day of the year. For Claire, it was just another day of hard work, cleaning up the remnants of preparation for an event she would not be a part of. She had no idea what role her boss had in store for her that evening. It was late in the afternoon, when most of the heavy lifting was done and she was exhausted, that Richard summoned her to his office. The room was a sanctuary of power, with dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a panoramic view of the city. Richard stood behind his massive mahogany desk, a thin, predatory smile on his lips. "Claire," he began, his casual tone making the order that was to follow all the more brutal. "We have a slight change in plans for the evening. You will be the entertainment. The piano." He paused, watching the color drain from her face. "At 10 o'clock. And where? Your uniform. I want everyone to know who you are." Richard's words fell on Claire like a death sentence. For a moment she couldn't process it. To play? In public? In front of her guests? And dressed in the uniform that symbolized her invisibility, her downfall? Her initial shock gave way to a wave of horror and humiliation so overwhelming that she felt the breath being knocked from her lungs. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked directly at him, a silent plea in her gaze, but Richard's face was a mask of cruel satisfaction. He saw her panic and reveled in it. "Don't worry," he said with cutting sarcasm. "I'm sure you still remember how it's done." The choice was impossible. To refuse would mean instant dismissal, thrown out on the street without a penny or a reference. To accept would mean the final desecration of her art, the public annihilation of her dignity. She felt cornered, a small creature trapped in the clutches of a predator. Her voice, cracking, barely a whisper, she managed to say, "Yes, sir." As she left the office, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The upcoming party was no longer just an event, it was her execution. The hours leading up to her performance were the longest of Claire's life. She hid in her small room at the back of the mansion, the muffled sound of music and conversation from the party seeping in through the door like poison. Her body shook uncontrollably. Her gray uniform felt tighter, more suffocating than ever. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had once been praised for their expressiveness and strength. Now they felt strange, the hands of a maid, not a performer. Anger began to bubble beneath the fear and humiliation. Anger at Richard for his unfathomable cruelty. Anger at fate for having driven her to this point. And anger at herself for having allowed herself to become so small, so silent. But then something deeper began to stir inside her. A spark, a distant memory of who she was. If he wanted a show, she thought with a flicker of defiance, then she would give him one. She would not play for him. She wouldn't play for her snobbish guests. She would play for her parents. She would play for the girl she had been in London. She would play to release the 3 years of music and pain that were trapped inside her. At 10 o'clock sharp, one of the security guards knocked on her door. It was time. The walk from her bedroom to the main living room felt a mile long. Each step was heavy, deliberate. As she emerged into the party area, an awkward silence fell over the crowd. 200 pairs of eyes turned to her, the anomalous figure in her maid's uniform amidst the glitz and glamour. She saw the looks of confusion, of mockery, of pity. The humiliation was a physical wave, hot and sickening. She held her head high, her eyes fixed on the piano, her only refuge amidst a sea of hostile faces. She could feel Richard's gaze on her, heavy and controlling, coming from his place of honor near the fireplace. He raised his glass in a silent, mocking toast. In that moment, Claire made a promise to herself. He could force her to sit at that piano, but he could not control the music that would come out of her. Music was the only thing that still belonged to her, and she would use it as a weapon, as a shield, as a declaration of her existence. She sat down on the Steinway's soft leather bench. The silence in the room was now absolute, charged with morbid curiosity. The guests were expecting a disaster, a bizarre interlude that would become an amusing anecdote at future parties. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply in the familiar smell of polished wood and felt. She ignored the crowd, ignored Richard, and sank into the inner sanctum of her mind. She thought of her parents, of her mother's proud smile, and then she placed her fingers on the keys. The first touch was hesitant, a silent acknowledgement between old friends. Then, with a deep breath, she began to play. The piece she chose was Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a work of turmoil, passion, and profound melancholy. It was the story of her life told in music. The first notes, dark and questioning, echoed through the room, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Mocking curiosity gave way to astonished attention. It was not the sound of an amateur. It was the sound of a master. The music flowed from her like a dammed river finally breaking its barriers. Her fingers, which for 3 years had held only sponges and rags, found their old language again, their instinctive dance on ivory. Chopin's ballad in her hands was not just a piece executed with technical perfection. It was a visceral testimony. The turbulent passages were her anger and despair. The moments of tender lyricism were her memories of love and loss. The powerful crescendo was her indomitable will to survive. The people in the room, the millionaires and the socialites, froze. Their champagne glasses stopped halfway to their lips. Conversation died. They were no longer watching a maid. They were witnessing an artist at her purest and most vulnerable, baring her soul for all to see. Claire was no longer at Belmont Mansion. She was on a stage, and the entire world had disappeared. There was only her, the piano, and the story she desperately needed to tell. Richard Belmont watched, his smug smile slowly freezing on his face. He had expected entertainment and eccentricity. What he was getting was a revelation. The music hit him with a force he hadn't expected, bypassing his defenses of cynicism and arrogance. He, who prided himself on being immune to emotion, felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. The raw beauty and pain in Claire's music were undeniable, and it both angered and fascinated him. He saw his guests, the people he had tried so hard to impress, completely mesmerized by her. Their attention was no longer on him, the master of the house, but on the figure in gray seated at the piano. The control he had prized so dearly was slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in a long time, Richard Belmont was not the most powerful man in the room. He was just another spectator, captive to the genius he had tried to humiliate and who was instead completely overshadowing him. As the last resonant note of Chopin's ballad faded into thin air, a deep, reverent silence filled the room. No one dared to breathe, but Claire was not finished. Before the spell could be broken by the applause, her fingers moved again, this time to a melody no one in the room had ever heard. It was hers, a composition that had been born in the lonely nights of her grief, that had matured in the silent years of servitude. She called it Solitude and Spark. The piece began with sparse, melancholy chords, painting the landscape of her grief, the grayness of her unseen life. It was the soundtrack of empty hallways and heartbreak. But then, slowly, a new melody emerged, a tiny spark of defiance, a note of hope that refused to be extinguished. The music grew in complexity and strength, becoming a declaration of resilience, a promise that even in the deepest darkness, light can still find a way. Claire's original composition was the final blow. It was the most authentic and devastating expression of her journey. The audience, already shaken by Chopin's performance, was completely overwhelmed. Tears streamed silently down the faces of men and women who had not cried in years. The music spoke of a universal truth, the pain of loss, the struggle for dignity, the inextinguishable spark of the human spirit. When the last triumphant and hopeful note echoed and finally faded, the silence that followed was broken not by polite applause but by an explosion of emotion. The people rose to their feet all at once, like a single wave, in a standing ovation that shook the walls of the mansion. This was not an applause for a maid who could play the piano. It was a tribute to an extraordinary artist who had transformed her pain into transcendent beauty. And in the midst of that thunderous acclaim, Claire opened her eyes, gasping, as if waking from a trance, and saw. She saw admiration, respect, humanity in the eyes of strangers. And she knew, in that instant, that she had gotten her soul back. Richard Belmont's humiliation was completely and undeniably public. He sat frozen in his seat, watching the scene unfold in slow motion. His guests, his court, now surrounded his maid, treating her like royalty. They showered her with compliments, questions, offers. The control he had so carefully orchestrated had backfired spectacularly. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, he had turned her into a star and himself into a villain. His attempt to display power had resulted in the most profound loss of authority he had ever experienced. People looked at him with a new perception, not with admiration, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. He, the all-powerful billionaire, had been publicly eclipsed by the talent and courage of a woman he had considered less than nothing. Anger and shame burned through his veins like acid. The show had been a success, but he was not the star, and that was too bitter a pill to swallow. Amid the chaos of admiration, one woman stood out. She had silver hair cut in an elegant bob, sharp eyes that missed no detail, and an aura of intellectual authority. It was Margaret Sinclair, the most feared and respected music critic in the country. She made her way through the crowd with quiet determination, her eyes never leaving Claire's face. When she finally reached her, she offered no empty compliments. Instead, she said in a low, intense voice, "What you did tonight, it was more than music. It was a resurrection. I need to know everything. Who are you?" Margaret's words, coming from such a prestigious source, were the final validation. They cut the last tether that bound Claire to her shameful past. She gave Margaret her name, the truth about her background, the condensed story of her downfall. Margaret listened intently, then took a card from her purse. "Call me tomorrow," she said. "Your life will change. I promise." In that moment, amidst the opulence of her workplace and the humiliation, Claire saw the first real glimpse of a future she thought had been buried forever. The next morning, the atmosphere in Belmont Manor was charged with an icy tension. The glow of the party had faded, leaving behind a heavy, accusatory silence. Claire was summoned to Richard's office, but this time, there was no mocking smile on his face. There was only cold, restrained fury. He did not invite her to sit. He stood, the embodiment of wounded authority. "Your services are no longer required," he said, his words sharp and precise. "Pack your things and leave within the hour. Your final payment will be sent to you." There was no argument, no explanation. It was an act of retaliation, pure and simple, a pathetic attempt to reassert the power he had lost. He could not silence her music, but he could banish her from his kingdom. For Claire, however, the dismissal was not a blow. It was a release. As she walked out of that office for the last time, she felt not fear, but an extraordinary lightness. He was throwing her out, but in truth he was only opening the cage door. She walked out of the Belmont mansion, not as a dismissed maid, but as a free woman, with a calling card in her pocket that held the promise of a new beginning. With the little money she had and a suitcase containing her modest belongings, Claire found herself in a world of frightening and exciting possibilities. The first thing she did was call Margaret Sinclair. The critical voice on the other end of the line was warm and matter-of-fact. "I've already made a few calls," Margaret said. "People are talking about you, Claire. The story of the invisible genius is captivating, but it's your talent that will sustain you." Margaret became more than a mentor. She became a figurehead, navigating the uncharted waters of the music world for Claire. She arranged interviews, scheduled auditions, and most importantly, gave Claire the confidence to believe that what happened at the party was not a fluke, but the true blossoming of her potential. For the first time in years, Claire was not alone. She had a powerful ally who believed in her, perhaps even more than she believed in herself at that moment. Margaret's promise was coming true. Claire's life was indeed changing at breakneck speed. Fueled by her new sense of purpose, Claire embarked on another important journey, to find her only living relative, her Aunt Helen, her mother's sister. They had lost touch after the tragedy, each withdrawn into their own grief. With Margaret's help and a little research, Claire located her in a small coastal town a few hours away. The reunion was tentative at first, heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. Aunt Helen was a down-to-earth woman, with her mother's kindness in her tired eyes and hands calloused from working in her small garden. Seeing Claire, frail but with a new light in her eyes, Helen's barriers crumbled. They held each other for a long time, an embrace that healed years of silence and loneliness. Helen insisted that Claire stay with her. In her modest, welcoming home, filled with the scent of earth and flowers, Claire found what she hadn't known she was looking for: a home, a place to rest, to breathe, to reconnect with the roots she thought she had lost forever. Her aunt's support became the fertile soil where her new life could finally begin to blossom. With the stability of a home and the support of Margaret and Helen, Claire began the hard work of rebuilding her career. Or rather, building it for the first time on her own terms. Margaret secured an audition for her with the conductor of the city's symphony orchestra, a man known for his rigor and his passion for new talent. The audition was in an empty theater, with just Claire, the conductor, and the grand concert on stage. The pressure was immense, but this time it was a different kind of pressure. It wasn't the pressure to please or to survive, but the pressure to be true to herself. She played with the same passion and honesty as she had played at the party, but with a new layer of confidence. The conductor, a man of few words, listened silently, his face inscrutable. When she finished, he simply said, "You will play the Grieg concerto with us next month, as soloist." The words hung in the air, as beautiful as any piece of music. Soloist. It was the word she had dreamed of hearing in London, a word she had thought had been erased from her vocabulary. Music was no longer just her profession. It was her healing instrument, her voice, her affirmation that she was here to stay. Rehearsals with the orchestra were a transformative experience. For the first time, Claire was not alone with her piano. She was surrounded by dozens of other musicians, each contributing their part to create a greater, more glorious whole. The sense of collaboration, of being part of a community of artists, was intoxicating. She learned to hear the violins, to breathe with the woodwinds, to feel the pulse of the cellos. The conductor, initially intimidating, became a guide, challenging her to find new depths in the music, to go beyond technique and play with intention and dialogue. The other musicians, initially curious about the legend of the Maid pianist, quickly accepted her, respecting her for her undeniable talent and her humility. She was no longer a spectacle or an anomaly. She was a colleague. At each rehearsal, Claire felt a piece of herself being restored. The music was filling the cracks in her soul, and the camaraderie of the musicians was healing the wounds of isolation. She was rediscovering not only her love of music, but also the joy of sharing it. The evening of the concert with the municipal orchestra marked Claire's true return to the stage. This time, there were no gray uniforms or humiliation. She wore a simple but elegant dress chosen by Aunt Helen. As she walked to center stage, she was greeted not with curious silence, but with warm applause from an audience that already knew her story. In the front row, she saw Margaret, smiling with pride, and Aunt Helen, with tears in her eyes. She sat at the piano, not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. As the orchestra began the introduction to Grieg's concerto, Claire felt a surge of calm and power. The music enveloped her, and she responded, weaving her part into the rich tapestry of sound. It was a conversation, a duet between her and the orchestra, a celebration of beauty and strength. The performance was a triumph, not just musically, but personally. At the end, as the audience rose to its feet in another ovation, Claire bowed, not to a man, but to the audience, to her fellow musicians, and most importantly, to herself. She had finally claimed her place in the world, a place defined not by her social standing, but by the art that emanated from her soul. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of growth and acclaim. Claire's story, fueled by glowing reviews from Margaret Sinclair and other critics who came to see her performances, captured the public's imagination. She became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of art to triumph over adversity. Concert offers began to pour in, not just from neighboring cities but from major music capitals around the world. London, Paris, Vienna. Names that had once been distant dreams were now real possibilities. But Claire, with Margaret's wise guidance and Helen's down-to-earth support, didn't get carried away by the hype. She chose her projects carefully, focusing on opportunities that would challenge her artistically and allow her to continue to develop her unique voice. Most important to her, however, was the work she was doing on her own music. The composition she had unveiled at Richard Belmont's party, Solitude and Spark, was just the beginning. She was working on something bigger, a piece that would tell her entire story. Claire's ultimate acclaim came in the form of a solo concert at one of the country's most prestigious theaters. The evening was billed as the world premiere of her masterpiece, Rebirth, a concerto for piano and orchestra in 4 movements. Tickets sold out within hours. The anticipation was electric. For Claire, this night was the culmination of her journey. It wasn't about proving anything to others, but about honoring her own path, with all its painful twists and triumphant turns. Backstage, as she listened to the murmur of the packed audience, she felt not fear, but a deep sense of peace. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had cleaned, polished, trembled with fear, and finally found her strength. They were no longer the hands of a victim or a survivor. They were the hands of a creator. She was about to share the most intimate composition of her life, the musical translation of her soul, and she felt ready, whole. Meanwhile, in a darkened box high above the theater, a figure watched the crowd bustling. Richard Belmont was there. He didn't know exactly why he'd come. In the months since he'd fired Claire, his life had become increasingly empty. Her story had grown, while his own had shrunk. His business contacts treated him with new reserve. His friends regarded him with barely concealed contempt. The story of the party had spread like wildfire, painting him as the monster he, in his more honest moments, knew he was. He'd come to the concert out of a toxic mix of curiosity, envy, and an inexplicable need to witness what he'd unleashed. He'd expected to feel anger, perhaps even perverse pleasure if she failed. But as he watched her silhouette walk onto the stage under the spotlights, greeted by a wave of love and admiration, he felt something different. A pang of something he barely recognized. Regret. The concert began with works by Bach and Beethoven, performed with a maturity and depth that silenced even the most skeptical critics. But everyone was waiting for rebirth. When the conductor raised his baton to begin the new work, a strange hush fell over the theater. The first movement, entitled The Fall, began with a lyrical and moving beauty that evoked dreams of London, only to be brutally interrupted by dissonant, chaotic chords, the musical representation of tragedy. Richard, in his box, felt a chill. The music was not just sad, it was the very embodiment of loss. He found himself, for the first time, imagining her pain, her shock, her loneliness. The music forced him to feel an empathy that he had spent his entire life avoiding. It was uncomfortable, it was unbearable, and it was only the beginning. The second movement, The Silent Veil, was perhaps the most frightening for Richard. Claire used the piano to create a repetitive, almost mechanical melody, while the orchestra produced sounds that evoked the echo of vast, cold hallways, the ticking of a clock, the desolation of silence. It was the sound of his mansion. It was the sound of the 3 years she had moved like a ghost through his house. He recognized the coldness, the emptiness, the oppression. The music exposed the atmosphere of his own life in a way that words never could. He felt exposed, naked in his darkened box. The music was a mirror, and the image it reflected was that of a man living in a mausoleum of his own creation, surrounded by beauty, but devoid of life. The piano melody, persistent and melancholy, was the sound of Claire's spirit refusing to die completely in this suffocating environment. Then came the third movement, the uncaging. It began abruptly, with a cacophony that represented the cruelty of Richard's plan, the humiliation of the party. But then the piano entered, alone. It was Chopin's ballade, but recontextualized, interwoven with themes of his own composition. The struggle was palpable. The music was a battle between oppression and freedom, between shame and self-assertion. And then the piano triumphed. The melody exploded into a passage of virtuosity and overwhelming passion, the orchestra joining in a cathartic celebration. Richard felt the scene of the party play out again in his mind. But this time, he saw it through her eyes. He felt fear turn to defiance, humiliation turn to power. The music did not accuse him. It simply told the truth. And the truth was that he had not broken her. He had freed her. Inadvertently, his cruelty had been the catalyst for her resurrection. The fourth and final movement, Ascension, was a work of pure beauty and hope. Leaving behind the darkness and conflict, the music opened up into wide, luminous harmonies. It was the sound of healing, of reconnection, of forgiveness. There were themes that evoked Aunt Helen's kindness, Margaret's strength, the joy of making music with others. It was an ode to the resilience of the human spirit. The main melody, played on the piano with crystal clarity, was a declaration of freedom and gratitude. As Richard Belmont, the man who never cried, listened, hot tears streamed down his face. The defenses he had built up over a lifetime crumbled. Claire's music had disarmed him completely, showing him not only the depth of his own cruelty, but the vastness of his own emptiness. He envied her richness of spirit, her courage to transform pain into art, her ability to feel so deeply. He, with all his billions, was the real pauper. As the final note of rebirth hung in the air, followed by a moment of stunned silence before an eruption of applause and cheers that seemed to shake the foundations of the theater, Richard sat motionless. The ovation continued for minutes, the audience standing, weeping, applauding the woman on stage who bowed with humble grace. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a former employee or a rival. He saw an extraordinary human being upon whom he had inflicted terrible pain. The shame he felt was so deep and overwhelming that he could barely breathe. It wasn't the shame of being socially outclassed. It was the moral shame of having tried to crush something so beautiful. He waited until the crowd began to disperse, and then, with a determination he hadn't felt in years, he headed backstage. He didn't know what he would say, but he knew he had to go. Backstage, the atmosphere was euphoric. Claire was surrounded by well-wishers, her Aunt Margaret, the orchestra musicians. She was beaming, her exhaustion overcome by the sheer joy of the moment. It was then that she saw him, Richard Belmont, standing at the edge of the circle of people, looking out of place and incredibly vulnerable. His expensive suit no longer fit, his arrogant posture gone, replaced by slumped shoulders. His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw not anger or contempt, but raw pain and a quiet plea. A hush fell over the group as they realized who he was. Instinctively, people braced themselves for hostility. But Claire, with a calmness that surprised everyone, including herself, gestured for him to come closer. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet from her. His voice, when he spoke, was hoarse and unrecognizable. "Miss Matthews." "Claire." He struggled for words. "What you did tonight. What I—" He shook his head, unable to form a coherent sentence. "I have no right to be here. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. What I did was unforgivable." He paused, looking at the floor. "I've always envied you. Not your talent exactly, but your courage. The courage to have something that is truly yours. Something that money can't buy." Then he confessed something no one knew. He had also played the piano when he was young with passion, but his father had forced him to give it up in favor of business, deriding the art as a futile pursuit. "I stifled my own music," he whispered. "And I tried to stifle yours too. It was monstrous." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Claire listened in silence, absorbing every word. She looked at the man before her and saw not the tyrant who had tormented her, but a broken man, a prisoner of his own choices and the expectations of others. She saw a dark reflection of what she might have become if she had let her grief and bitterness consume her. In her heart, she felt no hatred, not even a need for triumph. She felt a surge of compassion. Forgiving him was not about absolving him. It was about releasing the last shred of power he had over her, the power of his resentment. In a soft voice, she replied, "I forgive you, Richard." The relief on his face was so profound that he nearly faltered. But she didn't stop there. She stepped forward and said something no one could have predicted. "It's never too late to find your way back to the music. It will always be waiting for you." The implicit offer in her words was an act of grace as stunning as her music. The seed of that incredible offer began to germinate. Over the next few weeks, Richard Belmont underwent a quiet transformation. He stepped back from his business, delegating responsibilities, to the astonishment of his board of directors. He sold the opulent mansion that had been the scene of his former arrogance and moved to a smaller, more discreet home. And he bought a piano. A simple upright, not a Steinway grand. He tried to play, but his fingers were stiff, his musical memory rusty from decades of neglect. The frustration was immense. He was about to give up when Claire's words came back to him. "She will always be waiting for you." With a humility he never knew he possessed, he picked up the phone and called Margaret Sinclair's office, asking to leave a message for Claire. The message was simple. "Are you serious? About the lessons?" Claire received the message during a break-in. Rehearsals for her European tour. She smiled. She knew Richard's redemption wouldn't be easy, but she saw the sincerity in his request. She saw a lost soul trying to find his way home. And music, for Claire, was home. She agreed. The first few lessons were awkward and tense. The man who had once given her orders now sat beside her, vulnerable and eager for her approval. He had been a terrible student at first. Impatient, frustrated with his own lack of skill, his old arrogance creeping in at times. But Claire was patient. She didn't just teach him the notes. She taught him to listen. She taught him to breathe with the music. She taught him to find the emotion behind the scales, to connect his heart with his fingers. She was giving him the tools, not just to play the piano, but to heal. Richard's journey with music was slow and arduous. There were days when he wanted to smash the piano to pieces, convinced that the talent he had long ago abandoned was dead forever. In those moments, Claire shared stories of her own struggles, of her own creative block during grief. She showed him that music was not about perfection, but about expression, no matter how imperfect. Gradually, something began to shift in him. He began to find small joys in hitting a chord, in playing a simple melody without mistakes. The obsessive focus he had once given to business, he now gave to practice. Music was rewiring his brain and his heart. He began to notice the beauty in small things, the color of the sky, the sound of birds. He was, note by note, becoming human again. As Richard underwent his personal transformation, Claire's career soared to new heights. She performed in the world's most famous concert halls, always with Rebirth as the centerpiece of her set. Her story and her music inspired millions. She became an advocate for music education in public schools, using her platform to ensure that other talents were not silenced by lack of opportunity. She never forgot where she came from. In every city she visited, she found time to play at hospitals or nursing homes, sharing the healing power of music with those who needed it most. She was more than a famous pianist. She was a beacon of hope. And through it all, she continued her weekly lessons with her most unlikely student, an anchor to her own humility and a constant reminder of the power of forgiveness. Claire and Richard's relationship evolved into something neither of them could have imagined. The power dynamic had completely dissolved, replaced by mutual respect and genuine affection. He became her unlikely confidant, the only one who understood the full extent of her journey because he had been such a crucial part of it. He attended all of her local concerts, not in a darkened box but in the regular audience, applauding with quiet, genuine pride. She, in turn, found in him a living testament to the transformative power of art. Watching him struggle and grow inspired her. Music had become the bridge between two worlds, two souls who had met in dissonance and were now learning to create a new harmony together. A year after the lessons began, something remarkable happened. Richard, still a mediocre but passionate pianist, had begun to compose. Small, simple pieces, full of a melancholy he had never been able to express before. One day, he shyly showed Claire one of his compositions. She sat down at the piano and played it. It was a simple piece, almost childlike in its structure, but it had an honesty and raw beauty that moved Claire deeply. It was the music of a man learning to feel again. In that moment, she felt the cycle of healing complete. The music he had tried to silence in her had returned to awaken him. "It's beautiful, Richard," she said, and meant it. "Keep going." And for the first time, he smiled. A genuine, unpretentious smile. The smile of a man who had finally found a glimmer of peace. Claire and Richard's story did not end with a romance or a traditional fairy tale ending. It ended with something perhaps more profound and lasting. It ended on a sunny afternoon in Richard's modest living room, with two pianos side by side. Claire was playing a complex piece by Ravel, and Richard watched her, not with envy, but with the admiration of a student for his teacher. When she finished, he turned to his own piano and played his own little composition. The sound was hesitant, the notes not perfectly even, but the melody was clear and full of feeling. At the end, they did not need to say anything. They simply shared a look of understanding and respect. There was no longer master and maid, oppressor and oppressed. There were just two musicians, two souls who had found each other through the darkness and walked together toward the light, united by the universal language of music and the discovery that the greatest work of art one can create is a life of kindness and redemption. Aunt Helen became a constant and beloved figure in Claire's life, the embodiment of her safe haven. She traveled with Claire on some of her tours, not for the glamour, but to make sure her niece was eating right and getting enough rest. Sitting in the front row of concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo, her face was a beacon of unconditional love, a humble reminder of Claire's roots. Helen never ceased to marvel at her niece's transformation from the broken girl who showed up on her doorstep to the strong, acclaimed woman on stage. But to her, Claire would always be the same little girl who once played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on her parents' old upright piano. Their relationship was the melody that kept Claire grounded, the constant harmony that reminded her that true success came not in the applause, but in the human connection and love that sustained her. Margaret Sinclair continued to be Claire's fiercely loyal mentor and friend. She wrote a book about Claire's journey, titled The Invisible Genius, which became a bestseller. The book focused not only on Claire's talent, but explored broader themes of class, opportunity, and the power of art to cross social barriers. Margaret used the story as a platform to advocate for change, to question who has access to culture and who is left behind. Together, Claire and Margaret established the Rebirth Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing scholarships and musical instruments to talented, low-income youth. Claire's legacy, they promised, would not only be her music, but the doors she would open for the next generation of unseen geniuses, waiting for their chance to be heard. The Steinway in the Belmont mansion found a new purpose. When Richard sold the house, he stipulated one condition of the sale: that the piano be donated. He contacted Margaret, and through the Rebirth Foundation, the magnificent instrument was given to a promising young pianist from a poor neighborhood. A girl who, like Claire, had immense talent, but no means to cultivate it. The handover of the piano was a moment of great emotion. The young woman, as she played the first notes on the instrument that had once been a symbol of oppression, wept with joy. The piano, which had been a silent witness to so much pain and an unlikely redemption, would continue to create music, to inspire dreams, to change lives. Its legacy, like that of Claire and Richard, transformed from a story of power and humiliation to one of hope and opportunity. 6 months after the scene in Richard's living room, Claire was preparing for a special concert, not in a large concert hall, but in the auditorium of a public school in the heart of the city. It was a fundraiser for the Rebirth Foundation. The opening act, to everyone's surprise, would not be a professional musician. It would be Richard Belmont. He was terrified. Backstage, his hands were shaking, and he was pale. "I can't do this, Claire," he whispered. "They'll laugh at me." Claire took his hand. His was cold, just as hers had been that fateful night in the mansion. "Richard," she said quietly, "don't play for them. Play for yourself. Just tell your story." He looked at her, the woman he had tried to destroy who had instead saved him. He took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. Richard sat down at the piano. The audience, a mix of wealthy patrons and families from the community, watched curiously. He was no longer the imposing billionaire. He was just a middle-aged man, visibly nervous. He put his fingers to the keys and began to play. It was his own composition, the simple, melancholy piece he had shown Claire. His fingers stumbled a few times, a note fell off here and there, but he didn't stop. He kept going, pouring into the music the story of his loneliness, his regret, and the fragile hope he had found. The audience didn't laugh. They listened. They heard the honesty, the vulnerability. They heard a man trying to redeem himself through the only language that could express the depth of his change. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then applause. It wasn't a thunderous ovation, but a gentle, warm, compassionate applause. It was the sound of forgiveness. The impact of Richard's performance that night was profound. For him, it was the ultimate validation that his new life was real. He no longer needed the armor of money and power. His vulnerability became his strength. For the audience, it was a powerful lesson in redemption. His story, told alongside Claire's, became the central example of the Rebirth Foundation's mission, that talent can be found anywhere, and that change is possible for anyone. The event raised a record amount of money, but more importantly, it built a bridge between communities, inspiring people from all walks of life to believe in the transformative power of art and second chances. Richard, a former narcissist, became one of the Foundation's most passionate and effective advocates, his own journey serving as its most powerful testimony. Claire's life continued to blossom in ways she never imagined. She found a balance between her international career and her personal life. She and Aunt Helen bought a small house together near the sea, a place of peace and inspiration. She continued to compose, her music becoming more complex and nuanced, reflecting not the pain of survival, but the joy and complexity of living fully. She did not become cynical or hardened by her trials. On the contrary, she became more empathetic, more connected to the humanity around her. Her suffering did not break her. It opened her up. She became the living embodiment of the message in her music, that from the ashes of loss, a spirit can be reborn, stronger, wiser, and infinitely more beautiful. Claire and Richard's story has somehow become a modern legend in the world of classical music and beyond. It has been told in magazine articles, documentaries, and even lectures on leadership and ethics. It has served as a parable about the true nature of power versus authority, about the intrinsic value of talent versus the superficiality of status. Many have wondered how Claire could forgive the man who treated her so cruelly. In an interview, when asked about this, her answer was simple and profound. "Richard Belmont gave me a terrible gift, wrapped in pain and humiliation. But within it lay the key to my own liberation. Forgiving him was not about erasing what he had done. but about deciding that the story of my life would be written by me, not by my wounds. Music has taught me that even the most painful dissonances can resolve into beautiful harmony. My life is but a reflection of that lesson. Richard, for his part, found a purpose that money could never give him. He devoted most of his time and his remaining fortune to the Rebirth Foundation. He wasn't just a donor, he was on the ground. He visited schools, helped unload trucks of instruments, sat with young students and listened to their stories. He found genuine joy in seeing a face light up as they played a violin for the first time or sat down at a piano. The kids didn't know him as a former billionaire. They knew him as Mr. Rich, the guy who loves music. The sadness that once lurked behind his expensive suits was replaced by genuine kindness in his now tired but serene eyes. He was building a legacy not of skyscrapers and corporate deals, but of opportunity and hope. One spring afternoon, a few years after it all began, Claire was visiting one of the schools that the foundation had supported. She walked down a hallway and heard the sound of a piano coming from a classroom. The melody was simple, familiar. It was Richard's first composition. Curious, she peeked through the door. There he was, sitting next to a girl of about 10, patiently teaching her the piece. The girl was frowning in concentration, her small fingers moving carefully over the keys. Richard was pointing to the sheet music, his voice low and encouraging. There was a lightness and joy in the scene that filled Claire's heart. The music had completed its healing circle. The man who had tried to silence one artist was now nurturing a new one, and the melody that had been born of his own regret was now a lesson of hope for a new generation. Claire didn't interrupt him. She just watched for a moment, gratitude flooding her. Gratitude for her journey, for her losses that led to her greatest gains, for the resilience of the human spirit, and for the power of music to redeem, heal, and connect. She thought of her parents and knew they would be immensely proud, not just of her awards and acclaim, but of this quiet moment of kindness, this legacy of compassion she had helped build from the rubble of her grief. She walked away silently, leaving the teacher and student with their music. Her own masterpiece, Rebirth, was not just a concert piece. It was a living truth, happening right there in that school hallway. Their story, then, is not about a happy ending where all troubles magically disappear. It is about a true ending. Claire went on to become one of the world's most revered artists, but her greatest joy remained in the quiet moments. A cup of tea with Aunt Helen, a new composition taking shape under her fingers, the smile of a child discovering music. Richard never became a great pianist, but he did become a great man. He found his redemption not in public absolution, but in the quiet, daily service of others. Their relationship remained a unique testament to friendship and respect, a testament to the fact that the deepest connections can be forged in the most unlikely places. What Richard and Claire built together was a new kind of family, one born not of blood, but of shared experience, forgiveness, and a shared love of music. They were joined by Margaret and Aunt Helen, forming an unlikely quartet that met regularly. Their gatherings were filled with laughter, good food, and, of course, music. Richard played his simple pieces. Aunt Helen hummed old folk songs, Margaret told stories from the art world, and Claire, at the piano, wove all those disparate threads into a beautiful tapestry of sound and affection. They were proof that family is not something you inherit, but something you build, often from the pieces of past lives. Years later, at a prestigious ceremony where Claire was receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award, she stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the audience, saw the faces of her unlikely family in the front row, and smiled. In her speech, she spoke not of her struggles or her triumphs. She spoke of harmony. Music teaches us, she said, that every note, high or low, soft or loud, has its place, and that the pauses, the silences, are as important as the sounds. My life has been full of high notes and low notes and of long, painful silences. But I have learned that all of these together are what create music, real music. I thank everyone who helped me find mine. Claire Matthews's journey, which began with the promise of stardom, plunged into the darkness of loss and invisibility, and re-emerged in a triumph of spirit, has become an enduring source of inspiration. She showed the world that a person's worth is not determined by their job, their uniform, or their bank account. True worth lies in the courage to be authentic, the resilience to overcome adversity, and the ability to transform pain into beauty. Her life became her greatest composition, a symphony of resilience that would continue to echo. Long after the last note of her piano faded into thin air, Richard Belmont, in his later years, found a piece he never imagined possible. He was often seen at foundation student recitals, sitting in the back, a proud grandfather to dozens of children who were not his own. He learned that true wealth was not in owning things, but in giving. His greatest pleasure was watching a student's progress, witnessing the joy on their faces as they mastered a new piece. He and Claire remained friends to the end. Their piano lessons turned into conversations about life, filled with wisdom and laughter. He never stopped thanking her, not only for teaching him to play, but for teaching him how to live. The mansion where Claire had served as a maid had, ironically, become the headquarters of the Rebirth Foundation. After passing through several owners, it was purchased by a consortium of philanthropists inspired by the story and donated to the organization. The cold, opulent rooms were transformed into music classrooms, practice studios, and a small recital hall. Where there had been silence and oppression, there was now the sound of scales, laughter, and the vibrant energy of young artists. And in the center of the main room, where Richard Steinway had once stood, there was now an open space where students gathered, a symbol that the heart of the house was not an object but the community that filled it. On a bronze plaque at the entrance to the foundation's new headquarters, a quote was engraved. It wasn't from a famous poet or an ancient philosopher. It was Claire's own words in one of her earliest interviews. Art cannot flourish in the darkness of invisibility. Our mission is simply to turn on the light. This simple phrase encapsulated it all. The pain she endured, the cruelty she faced, all were transformed into a greater purpose. Her personal story became a universal call to recognize and nurture talent wherever it exists, regardless of the barriers of class or circumstance. Claire and Richard's ultimate legacy wasn't just about music, it was about rewriting narratives. Claire rewrote hers, from victim to victor, from invisible to unforgettable. Richard rewrote his, from villain to redeemed, from master to servant of a greater cause. Together they rewrote the narrative of their own story, transforming an act of cruelty into a healing partnership. They showed that stories are not fixed, that forgiveness can change the ending, and that redemption, though difficult, is always within reach for those brave enough to seek it. In one of their last conversations, Richard asked Claire if she ever resented what he had put her through. She thought for a moment, then answered with complete honesty. "I don't love the memory of the pain, Richard, but I'm grateful for what it taught me. It taught me that my strength was greater than I thought. It gave me my truest music, and in a strange and unexpected way, it gave me a friend. I wouldn't change any of that." In those words, there was not only forgiveness, but a deep and graceful acceptance of the complex and imperfect symphony of her life. The story, then, ends as it began, with music, but not in a grand concert hall under the spotlights. It ends with the sound of a child laughing as he strikes a chord, with the sound of an elderly man playing a simple melody with a heart full of gratitude, and with the sound of a woman's music echoing throughout the world, a constant reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit, fueled by art, can not only survive, but rise to unimaginable heights of grace and beauty. The genius who was once invisible became a light for all to see, and the powerful man who lived in the darkness of his own creation finally found his way to the warmth. Together, their lives intertwined to create a final harmony, a lasting proof that the most beautiful music is often born of silence, and the truest redemption is born of the courage to face dissonance and transform it into a song of hope. They did not just find happiness, they built it, note by note, from the ruins of a painful past, creating a legacy that was, in itself, a masterpiece of humanity.